Day 1295 of the Ukrainian war map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 1,091,000 military personnel losses, which represents an additional 890 in the past day, which is once again lower than what the past has brought, but a pattern that aligns with Russia's overall battlefield position this year to date. Then as for hardware losses, 4 tanks, 2 APVs, 22 artillery, and 20 regions within Russia now affected by a worsening fuel shortage crisis across the country, with one Russian newspaper warning that the country is on the verge of a full-scale fuel crisis. Izvestia, the leading Russian media outlet and one of the Kremlin's most loyal newspapers, is now forced to admit Russia faces a fuel shortage. The paper reported that gasoline scarcity has spread to more than 10 regions, with some independent stations closing altogether, noting that the 10 figure quoted there is a very conservative estimate, reported on their end, unsurprisingly, with open source investigations showing that the fuel shortages have in fact hit 20 regions. They may have just halved the number. And so if Izvestia is reporting on fuel shortages, then you know the situation is not looking good. Of course, the outlet was careful and towed the line a bit, instead blaming complex causes, such as high demand in logistics, while calling Ukraine's refinery strikes only an additional factor, quote-unquote, sidelining the main cause. So when even pro-Kremlin media stops denying the crisis, even with the expected sugarcoating on top, it shows that Russia isn't just short on fuel, it's running out of excuses, and losing the ability to control the narrative. Now to the map, as overnight in the Black Sea, Ukraine's defense intelligence scored another high-value strike as a drone hit a Russian Project MPSV 7-class vessel guarding the entrance to Novorossiysk. The target, widely identified as the Spasitel Demidov, is no ordinary ship, though technically a multifunctional salvage and survey vessel. Russia has been using it in a military role, equipped with electronic reconnaissance gear, remotely operated vehicles, diving complexes, and sonar. At the time of the strike, it was patrolling the approaches to Novorossiysk Bay, where what remains of the Black Sea Fleet has shifted after the loss of Sevastopol as a safe harbour. Now, reports and footage indicate that the combat drone hit the bridge area, disabling navigation and communication systems and destroying electronic warfare equipment. Such a strike puts the ship out of service and in need of costly repairs. And with a price tag of roughly 60 million USD, and only 4 vessels of its class in Russia's fleet, the damage becomes nothing to sneeze at. Meanwhile, next door, before those events, Ukrainian forces struck in Crimea, where low-flying cruise missiles masked by terrain slipped past S-300 and Pantsir defenses to hit underground Russian artillery depots, igniting secondary explosions and fires. And then, early this morning, in the village of Vitino, the Russian Aerospace Forces Communications Center was attacked. Preliminary reports say 2 jet drones hit the headquarters, the building, and the communications hub. Havoc being wreaked. In fact, Russian military blogger Rybar writes that since August, Ukrainians have significantly intensified airstrikes on occupied Crimea, mainly in the western part. He stated that these strikes had primarily destroyed radar stations and communication centers of air defense systems, which we've seen a lot of in Crimea recently. And his final assessment? Rybar notes that Ukraine's goal is to wear down the peninsula's air defense shield as much as possible and open a corridor for a large-scale offensive, which is more than a fair evaluation of the situation. Then into the main map, starting in the Seversk direction, as following an engagement between both armies, Russian forces lost 2 tanks, 3 armoured carriers, and 11 motorcycles, with the overall offensive repelled by Ukrainian units from the 81st Aeromobile Brigade of the 11th Army Corps, never even seen or making direct physical contact with the occupying forces. And it's an impressive hardware haul in terms of Russian mechanized assault offerings these days. And given the FPV involvement in neutralizing this attack, it fits to mention that even Russian commanders admit how far behind Moscow has fallen in the drone war. Chechen commander Hades concedes that while Russia boasts of missiles, aircraft, and long-range strike drones, It has no edge in short-range systems, the very weapons shaping today's battles. He says Russia was the first to use fiber-optic drones, but that Ukraine not only caught up, but rather surged ahead in numbers and efficiency. He also mentioned that his own positions were hit nearly 90 times, proof of what he calls Ukraine's insane outputs. By contrast, he said Russia lacks mass production, leaving its units exposed to relentless swarms. And getting into the more technical, he points to Russia's reliance on simple ground control stations, while Ukraine operates advanced stations that can switch frequencies and use aerial repeaters, with the first overcoming electronic warfare and the second giving their drones extended range. And so, Russian electronic warfare, he admits, cannot jam them effectively. By his accounts, Russia is running simply to stay still, behind in numbers, technology, and doctrine. What a scathing indictment of Russia's own military that is stifled by an aversion to innovation. Then headed down the map to the main central front, with the Ukrainian defense forces continuing to push back the enemy near Volodymyrivka, and taking further ground to the southeast of that settlement, and a liberation patch update to the north. And to say push back could be most appropriate here, as the map changes also saw a physical relocation of Russian positions, losing land to the west, replacing it with a sliver of land to the northeast of the adjacent settlement of Poltavka. Beyond that, west of the river, Russian troops hold a shallow salient that looks more like a trap than a launch pad. Pinned by Ukrainian fire from three sides, the pocket relies on a single exposed G-lock, making every resupply a target for artillery and drones. Ukraine is no doubt working to cut the east-west road, on top of that, to choke the southern neck and keep pressure on both shoulders. Unless Moscow can widen the pocket or open new routes, the position will bleed out under sustained Ukrainian strikes. Then to the further east in Donetsk, where there's been a number of reported accidents of friendly fire incidents, with this one case of friendly fire noted as somewhere in the rear area, coming from Russia's failed air defenses that were activated, missile off course. But also noted was another case of a friendly fire from a day earlier, as Russian Tu-95 strike aircraft that launched a cruise missile from farther afield in Russia had failed at the 3/4 way mark, only to have it slap occupied Donetsk in the face. The Tu-95 misfire is particularly notable, a strategic aircraft firing from deep inside Russia, delivering a strike onto Russian-held territory, displaying further signs of systemic flaws in targeting, deconfliction, which is the process of coordinating military operations to prevent unintended engagements or friendly fire, and questions of missile reliability too. Then to take a look around the map as found somewhere in the east, a resident of Russia's Far East Sakhalin Island that was sent to fight in Ukraine, but said he got lost there. Captured and questioned, he said he doesn't know what his task was, he fell behind his group because he broke or sprained his leg, detached from his unit, and wanted to return home, but got a bit lost. Luckily, Ukrainian soldiers found him and kindly gave him a cig. He probably has no idea how lucky he actually is. And then speaking of POWs, there was also early reports of a Russian soldier who was positioned with two commanders, shot them, destroyed the position, and surrendered to Ukrainian fighters. Difficult to determine the details from these early stage reports. We'll get the full story later, which is often the case. Yet there's no shortage of similar stories coming out of the past. Russian soldiers low on morale, operating under the harshest conditions, with enemies on all sides, which includes from their own commanders who will happily give them a beating until the morale improves, as the expression goes, derived from the realities of Russian soldiers, and where the commanders send them on no-hope kamikaze assaults, as per the very own words of many disgruntled soldiers, usually in video form, coming on the night before an early morning raid. Then to take a peek on the map at the country next door, in the west, with yesterday's Russian drone incursion that still hangs heavy over Poland, drones launched from Russia and Belarus cut into Polish skies, forcing Polish and NATO forces fire in defense of the NATO territory for the first time in this war. What was once unthinkable has quickly escalated into skirting dangerously close to baseline activity. Poland's air force, with NATO fighters alongside, downed 4 of the incoming drones that posed a definitive security risk. One struck a residential block in Veriki, others scattered wreckage across towns like Nishkuf and Oleshno. On top of that, at least 5 drones flew toward the NATO base in Rzeszów. This base serves as a major logistics hub through which the Ukrainian army receives supplies from its Western allies. Now, the message from Warsaw was blunt. This was a large-scale provocation and the closest the country has stood to direct war since 1945. Airports from Warsaw to Lublin briefly were silent, Article 4 was invoked, and Poland's neighbors knew the conflict had arrived at their doorstep. Poland has now closed the border between itself and Belarus, halting the crossing of both individuals and goods, and had also introduced a temporary no-fly zone along its eastern border with Belarus and Ukraine in the wake of the drone incursion. That might sound like it's shutting Ukraine out, but the opposite is actually true, as any bogey identified around the border between Ukraine and Poland is likely now to get shot down by Polish air defenses, which is something that Ukraine had looked for all along. Now, for the previous day's events, investigators have since recovered 16 wrecks. The drones were identified as mostly the Jabera models, with reports on some containing dual fuel tanks, suggesting a deliberate design for extended range and targeted strikes from Russian territory. And the timing looks to be no accident either. The incursion played out under the cover of Zapad 2025 exercises, the joint Russian-Belarus military exercises mostly staged in Belarus, and designed to test NATO's reflexes. Germany's defense minister Boris Pistorius called it a provocation in plain terms. The UN Secretary General warned of a real risk of escalation, and while Washington has tried to keep a lid on it, Donald Trump offered only a shrug on Truth Social. Feast your eyes on that tweet right there, leaving Poland to wonder what weight American security guarantees now carry. Poland stood firm and Europe rallied, and in the end, Moscow's provocation may prove its own undoing, only hardening Europe's resolve and tightening the solidarity it hoped to fracture. Then headed to something of a quick funny to round out the video today, and on the topic of the less technologically advanced Russian FPV drones, with their undertrained operators it would also appear in this case, as here we see 3 Russian fiber optic FPV drones waiting in ambush, and so very obviously sitting on the road, almost as if they've got their thumbs stuck up their behinds, looking completely oblivious, and in far too close a proximity to one another. So what happens? An AFU drone comes flying along, spots them, and cleans them right up. They never saw it coming. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like and comment, and thanks once again for all of the support, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!